My name is Dave Gio, and I'm the ACI's History Fellow. You probably figured that out already. I think I'm one of two people wearing elbow patches to a tech conference. So you probably noted me right away. But this is reporting on the future. Full disclosure, I'm not a journalist, but I did stay at Holiday Inn Express last night. So I'm going to do my best and bring out the best of our journalists, authors, investigative reporters, members of the media, et cetera. So let me please introduce Fred Kaplan. Fred is the national security columnist for Slate, the author of 5 books, most recently Dark Territory, The Secret History of Cyber War, which I'm officially plugging right here. That's my copy, please don't steal it. He's won several awards for journalism and earned his PhD at MIT. He's been a fellow with the Council on Foreign Relations and also the New America Foundation. Kim Zetter, to my immediate left, is an award-winning investigative journalist who has been covering computer security since 1999, first for PC Magazine and more recently for Wired. She's an expert on the Stuxnet worm in particular and wrote an outstanding book on the topic, Countdown to Zero Day, which has a really nice cover, actually. It's kind of tactile and I really like that.
Paper's kind of waxy.
Yeah. I picked it up and I thought I have to have this. And I plug for West Point. When you go into our bookstore, it's World War I, World War II, the Civil War, and then this much of everything else. But we actually now have a cyber warfare section in our bookstore. So who says we can't catch up with the time? So it's actually able to get both of these at West Point. So anyway, I think we're making progress. In terms of the importance of the historical perspective, the great intelligence historian Christopher Andrew said that the great sickness of our time is that we suffer from something called HASD, H-A-S-D-D, Historical Attention Span Deficit Disorder. And I think that's true. And so for me as the history fellow, I like to try to bring out where we've been. And I think to quote Winston Churchill, the farther back you can look, the farther forward you can see. And so I want to take that and take a long-term historical perspective, but also then bring it up to reporting on the future with a particular focus on how you address what does it mean to be a security correspondent or a cybersecurity correspondent, if that's even a thing that we can now put on the map. So let's get right to it, and I'll just open this up as a coin toss. What is the role of the press and of journalists and journalism in investigating and reporting on cyber issues?
Boy. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to this. It's a very fascinating subject and group of people you've assembled. I think with cyber, with most topics, people kind of generally know what's going on. And so the number one duty of a reporter is to report the latest news, right? I think in this topic, though, it is so new and it is seen by many people as so forbidding and technical and frightening to the extent that they've read much about it at all, that maybe one duty somewhere along the way is to kind of explain and to provide some perspective. And I guess what I've done in this book and what I do also in some of my Slate columns is to point out that this is not a new thing. I mean, there are new angles in it, and it's spreading, and it's damaging more and more things. But, I like to go back, and not very many people even in the industry realize this, but I mean, it goes back. And this isn't just a historical curiosity. It has a profound implication. It goes back all the way to the dawn of the Internet itself. And I'm going to make this story very brief, but in 1967, so almost 50 years ago, as the ARPANET was about to go online, there was the head of the computer science department at the RAND Corporation, a guy named Willis Ware, who had worked with von Neumann on the first computers, and he was on the scientific advisory board at the NSA. He wrote a paper, and it was secret at the time, but it's been declassified, and it's a fascinating document to look at. And he said, look, the thing you need to realize is that once you put information on a network, once you have access online, he used the word online, it might have been the first use of that word, online to multiple unsecured locations, you are creating inherent vulnerabilities. You're not going to be able to keep secrets anymore. And when I did my research, I went to the guy who was running the program at DARPA, and I said, were you familiar with the Willis Ware paper? And he said, oh, sure, I knew Willis. And I said, well, what'd you think? And he said, well, I took it to my team, and they looked at it, and they said, oh, God, don't saddle us with a security requirement, too. I mean, look how hard it was just to do what we've done. It would be like telling the Wright brothers that their first plane has to carry 20 people for 50 miles. Let's take this one step at a time. It's going to be decades before the Russians can do anything like this. And, it did take decades. It took 2.5, 3 decades, by which time whole systems and networks had grown up that had no provision for security. So I see this as sort of the bitten apple in the digital Garden of Eden. And if you look at it that way, you see the things that are happening now as almost inevitable, as things that were predicted from the very beginning, that are embedded in the system that has been created, and that there's not much you can do about that basic fact unless you went and started all over again, which isn't going to happen. So I think, in terms of then, whether you're a practitioner or a security specialist or a hacker or somebody who's just interested in it, it's kind of significant to realize that, okay, there are going to be vulnerabilities. There is no magic tool here. There is no, as some people in the NSA thought for quite a while, there is no algorithm that is going to create the perfect impenetrable black box. This is the way it is. And the more that this network or networks spread to cover more and more of our lives, we are creating inherent vulnerabilities. There was a DSB report not long ago which talked about the inherent fragility of our architecture. The inherent fragility of our... So in thinking about the problems and what to do about it, it's useful to realize that, we have to deal now with the consequences, not with trying to repair a problem that's embedded in the very thing that we're discussing.
That's a lot, and so we're gonna we have several questions to kind of pick that apart. But I wanted to turn to Kim and ask her about just the core sort of role of the press in the topic.
So I started covering, my career as a journalist has been primarily in the tech press. I've written for mainstream publications as well, but I came up in the tech press. And so I've sort of seen the role change as cybersecurity became something significant and even noticed by mainstream press because it was ignored for a long time. So I started out, as he mentioned, with PC World magazine. And I started in 1999, and the year after I started there, first of all, I'll say I didn't even want to get into tech writing because it was so niche. But the year after I started at PC World, I went to the DEF CON Hacker Conference 2000, which was the year that the Cult of the Dead Cow was releasing Back Orifice. And that just, the entire community amazed me, just the intelligence in the community, the variedness of it, and I wanted to convey that to the public. I mean, if I was amazed by this, that this exists, and that there are these people that are, on the one hand, present a certain amount of threats, but on the other hand, the majority of the people at the DEF CON Hacker Conference were not there to attack systems for purposes, for nefarious purposes, but for good purposes. And so my role then that I saw as the press was to convey this other side of what we saw as hackers, to show the good work that security researchers do. And that's really what my focus was to try and sort of raise that community. But that was, within largely the tech community. And so now I see my role much more in the last few years of not just sort of educating the larger community, but educating mainstream media. And what I find a lot is, so when we have controversial issues like the Apple FBI case, or even things like, hacking the election, the Russians hacking the election, oftentimes mainstream media is just sort of off and running with whatever U.S. officials will tell them, or even whatever a security company that's hyping something will tell them. And so I sort of see our role of people who've been in this for a while as trying to rein that in and say, okay, here are actually the facts. Let's look at like with the Apple FBI. A lot of the immediate reporting was about that this was about getting Apple to unlock the phone. And everyone was saying, why can't Apple just unlock this phone? They've unlocked all of these other phones. And that really wasn't what the issue was about. They were asking Apple to do something entirely different. So I sort of saw my role there in sort of giving an explainer of exactly what it is. And then the rest of the media, you could sort of see, it wasn't just me, there were other people as well in the security community that were sort of setting the role straight. And then you see the rest of the media sort of falling in line and then understanding it. So I think, at least as a tech reporter, our role is to not just explain to the general public, but also help the mainstream media understand the issues better.
Let's pull that out a little bit, because Apple FBI is something that I think everybody can kind of relate to, and how do you? There's a level of expertise, both technical and legal, that needs to be understood before you can start writing on that. Did you feel that you had to get yourself to a place where you had a certain level of understanding, or as a historian, right? The greatest fear is that we're one Wikipedia page ahead of our students or something. How do you get yourself to a place where the legal bits, you're not a lawyer, and the tech bits, you're not a coder or something? How do you prepare yourself and then say, okay, I've got it. Let me roll this out.
Well, so in some stories, obviously your history of covering similar things informs even a new story. So you don't necessarily have to get up to speed on things. With the Apple FBI case, I did have to get up to speed on the Apple mobile security. The secure enclave was something that a lot of people, even in the tech community, we weren't quite up to speed on exactly how does this work, how does the secure architecture and the infrastructure in the Apple iPhone prevent Apple from helping the FBI. And that's what the security community is great for. They are ready and willing and patient with you. If you are legitimately and sincerely interested in finding this out, they will sit with you and they will walk you through it and explain it. So in some cases, you already know the information you need, but then there's this entire community out there that's there to help you.
But there's also a broader, again, historical framework in which I think the Apple FBI feud needs to be viewed. And that is the fact that what's really going on here is that, well, for nearly a century, there has been a history and a tradition of telecom, what would be now called telecom companies, cooperating with law enforcement and intelligence agencies, dating back to the World War I era intelligence community that was persuaded by Western Union to let them look at every telegraph that goes in and out of the country. We all know about AT&T helping the NSA tap phones. If you were Microsoft and Cisco trying to sell your stuff to the Defense Department, it had to be vetted. Who vets that? The NSA. I've been told that the first Microsoft Windows operating system that went through this process, the NSA found 1,500 points of vulnerability and then helped Microsoft patch these. But not all of them. They didn't patch all of them. They left a few open so that they could use them too. And Microsoft was wink, wink, nudge, nudge, fine with that. Ditto when the Chrome source code was hacked by the Chinese. The NSA helped fix that, and everybody was fine with it. So what Tim Cook, in a way, was trying to do with the iOS 8 was to disrupt this history, was to change this history. To devise this code so that the next time the NSA came to them or the FBI and said, we need to open up this phone, you could say, oh, I'd love to, I can't. This is in the user's hand, I can't do anything about it. And that was a deliberate attempt, and we can argue about whether it's good, bad, or whatever, but the whole conflict was within this history, where Tim Cook said, enough, I've had enough of this, I don't want to be a part of it anymore. This isn't a new battle. It's whether to continue or to disrupt this relationship in a new era when encryption is become much more difficult. So definitely that there's a technical element that needs to be understood so that you understand the difference between, the 70 times that Apple opened up phones in the past and what this one is different. But the real issue, the FBI was looking for a case to perpetuate its relationship. And they found this case in San Bernardino that they thought it was a good case for them. No privacy rights, the guy is dead. No Fourth Amendment issue, the phones were owned by the county. And they said, yeah, sure, take it, whatever you want. The political optics looked pretty good for them. Mass murderer with a self-proclaimed link to a terrorist organization. They were looking for a legal avenue to keep this open, and Apple was trying to resist that. So I think, there's two ways you can look at it, and then you need a historical background or a technical expertise to really get at what's going on here.
Well, Fred, you have as I mentioned, you have a PhD from MIT, which I suppose helps.
In political science.
Okay, well, so I think at MIT...
I'm a phony doctor, a PhD.
Thanks for that. Yeah, so I guess, but for Kim, if you're saying that the expertise is out there and that people are willing to help you, is that in some ways, if you turn it on its head, an indictment of some of the mainstream press in cyber reporting or in intelligence reporting generally? Because there are people out there who know what they're talking about. There are people or other resources who can help you, other companies that specialize in this and put a lot of stuff out there. So I hear you saying that it's possible to be done right, but then people in the media might not be doing it right.
So I think that my feeling is a reporter's only as good as their sources. And if you've got really good sources, obviously, you want to be, there's more to reporting than that because you want to have the ability to assess what someone is telling you. But that's part of your battle is if you've got good sources, you're halfway there. The other part is knowing who's a good source and who's a bad source. And that's the problem that I see happening quite often in media, especially when they're coming to a topic that's new, is that you don't quite often know who to listen to and who to ignore. And so we see stories, particularly in the tech community, when we see a story published by, I don't want to point a finger at certain media outlets, but there are some specific outlets who have published some pretty egregious stories, and everyone in the tech community gets very up in arms about it because it's clear that they didn't know who to listen to. So that's part of it is the information is out there, and I think it's the same on any beat, whether it's technology or what. It's just knowing who are the people that have the information and who are the people that you should listen to, and just completely.
For example, I'm a Cold War kid. I'm older than I think anybody in this room. So I came up I got a degree in the late 70s. My PhD was in MIT. They had a security studies division within the poli-sci department. I studied nuclear stuff, nuclear strategy, all this stuff. So things come about, starting in the early 80s, all this nuclear stuff happening, arms control treaties and disruptions. And so a lot of newspapers were looking for experts because it was too complicated for ordinary people to understand. And so I was hired by the Boston Globe, and like Michael Gordon, who'd been doing stuff for the National Journal, was hired by the New York Times. There were a bunch of us like this because they reached out and got people, and I'd always wanted to be a reporter anyway, but who knew something about the subject. This hasn't happened yet with cyber stuff. There are people who have come about it
except through the tech media.
Well, but I mean in mainstream.
Yeah.
I mean, how come the Washington Post hasn't reached out and let's get Kim Zetter, who's written about this for Wired. Let's get, it hasn't much happened yet.
They did have, and they got rid of, but
okay, well, whatever. But it's happening a little bit. And people, there are people in the mainstream press who kind of have developed their own expertise. They've found the right guru to go talk to. And you're right. Finding the right guru is a big thing. Everybody finds a guru. You just don't know at the beginning whether it's the right one or not. So it's developing, but it is like everything else in this field, still at a primitive stage.
He brings out the Washington Post, and there's a.
I did that arbitrarily.
Well, I think that there's a sort of talking about sort of what you need as a reporter, especially when knowing what you don't know, right? Recognizing what you don't know and when you need help. Mm-hmm. And the Washington Post is a good example of this when they published their first story about the Snowden documents, about the PRISM program. The reporter who was doing that didn't understand the technology that he was looking at when he was reading these slides. And as a result of this, he misinterpreted it, and the story was wrong. And wrong in a really big way. I mean, what he essentially wrote in looking at these slides was that the NSA had a direct tap into the servers of Google and Yahoo and these companies and could just sort of siphon out what they wanted. And if you look at the slides, I mean, once the slides got published and we looked at them, the community looked at them and said, he's wrong. I mean, you could see it if you knew it, right? And they learned from that mistake, and then they hired a tech consultant. They hired Ashkan Soltani going forward to look at the tech stuff for them and vet that. But that's a big mistake. I mean, that was a really good move on their part, but unfortunately they made a big mistake to get there.
I suspect that Edward Snowden might not have understood it completely either.
Well, you don't say.
Well, a lot of these are slides, so they're out of context, and so
right,
it is hard to interpret.
Yeah.
Well, so we're now about 22 minutes in, and we've heard the name Ed Snowden twice, and I was going to hold off for longer, but you guys have brought this on yourselves. So
yeah.
I mean, how do we? So full confession, in the green room before we were talking about, is there a peculiarity towards cyber sources in media that's a little bit different? Maybe from the national security beat or the economics beat or some other beat. But with Snowden, I want to ask the question before my heart rate explodes about the topic. How do you as journalists, right? I mean, so for me, I'm on record as saying that he's done great harm, and I do think that's the case. But if I were a journalist, if the shoe were on the other foot, I would be like, well, this is superb. Right. I mean, this is really,
This is what you wait for.
Right. I mean, who needs these unnamed officials on background? Now I have, 1.5 million or whatever documents are available. So can you kind of talk to mass leaking and generally, WikiLeaks, generally, whatever, Snowden, just as one part of that, as an investigative source or as a journalistic source?
Well, I mean, the Snowden leak was very peculiar because most leakers, they have an agenda, and you have to keep that in mind. But every
source has an agenda.
But it may or may not be pertinent. But for example, when Daniel Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers, there were parts of the papers that he did not Xerox and that he did not leak because he thought that this was genuinely secure stuff that nobody should see. At the time that Daniel Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers, he had security clearances up the wazoo. He had worked on extremely classified studies of the nuclear command control system. He didn't leak any of that stuff. Snowden just kind of takes a bunch of stuff and hands it to Glenn Greenwald, and there's a scene in Laura Poitras's film,
Citizen4.
Yes, which if I were a prosecutor, I would show as Exhibit C anyway, where he says, now, there is some material in these papers that is classified for a legitimate reason, and if it got out, it could do grave damage. So I'm going to trust that you'll be responsible with this. And the problem with that, aside from the fact is whether you'd give anything, I mean, you shouldn't give that to me and say I try. I don't know. I might not know what it is to be responsible with this kind of stuff. There were my view on Snowden, and I've written this, is that if all he had done were to leak, say, these dozen documents which show that NSA domestic surveillance is far vaster than anybody knows, then I would, he probably still would have gone to jail for a little, but I think that's something worth championing. I think he misunderstood what it means, but still this is something worth having a discussion about, raising questions about the proper purview and scope of the NSA, which is chartered as an agency that intercepts foreign intelligence. But, a lot of what he gave them, just on the basis of stories that were based on it, concern, NSA intercepts of Taliban communications, of stuff going on in Iran, in Iraq, in Asia. And, whether you like or dislike the policies that these things are supporting, this is part of the chartered activity. This is what the NSA does, right? So it's not whistleblowing. It's like it's essentially taking down an intelligence agency. And I think, that's where he crossed the line, and I don't know whether he knew that he was crossing a line or what, but in terms of dealing with leaks in general, and you're right, with this stuff in particular, it's been ensconced in extreme secrecy because it's been embedded in the NSA and things like the Air Force Information Warfare Center, where everything is by nature class. Until not that long ago, the joke was that NSA stands for no such agency. The very utterance of the name of the agency was class. Signals and communications intelligence in the 80s, that phrase, you could go to jail for uttering that phrase. I mean, that's how embedded this stuff is. And so to get into that world and then to make distinctions about, okay, yeah, this is classified, but I think it's important that it get out there anyway, versus this is classified and, well, maybe not. I mean, there are a couple of things that I put together and got confirmed in researching my book that I just decided not to print. And I'm sure, Kim, you've probably made, every reporter I know who deals with national security has made that decision. Seymour Hersh, who used to be one of the great investigative reporters, he uncovered the Glomar Explorer and was convinced not to publish it. And then when Jack Anderson published the same thing, he went with it. He had the story ready to go. He withheld it because, as he told a Rolling Stone reporter at the time, hey, I'm a patriot too. So it does get into almost philosophical issues, and they're ethical dilemmas. And as I said, this is, and all reporters that I know in this business, there have been times when they'll call up somebody in the White House and say, listen, I have something I need to come talk to you about, and here it is, and tell me why I shouldn't publish this. And then often they say, okay, you've made a convincing case, or they'll say, well, how can we word this so that the stuff that's really important that you think needs to be kept secret is not revealed, or screw it, thank you very much, but I disagree with it, I'm going to go with it anyway.
Kim, Snowden as a source, or mass leaks as a reliable source?
You're right to make a distinction between sort of what we consider ordinary leaks about a specific issue, and also even a whistleblower leak where you have specific wrong that you want to expose, and a mass leak that is encompassing a lot of things. These are difficult issues to tackle, and no reporter wants to be making this decision on their own. You want to consult with editors and lawyers, and you go to the White House or the NSA and you give them a chance to make their case. However, I'm going to disagree with Fred on the concept that Snowden shouldn't give something to a reporter and let the reporter make that determination on their own. All classified information that reporters have ever published, it's not all necessarily what you would consider something that should be published. Let me take James Risen's book, where he exposed another Iranian covert, another U.S. covert program against the Iran nuclear program. He was exposing, this was an operation that was involving a nuclear scientist from Russia who had become, what do you call it when you seek asylum? He was in asylum here, and the government, the CIA, wanted to use him to feed false information, so basically feed the Iranian government false blueprints for a nuclear weapon. And the idea was to seed false information and set the Iranians back, their scientific research back. Very risky program here, particularly for the scientist. If the Iranians determine that he's feeding them false information and possibly intentionally, his life is at risk here. And he understood that risk, and apparently he slipped a little note into the documents that he was giving them saying, you'll probably notice that there's a little problem with the blueprints that I'm giving you, and that's intentional, and I can help you fix that, or something to that effect. He wanted to let them know that he wasn't intentionally trying to. But anyways, you might ask, what's the point of exposing that kind of program? And there are a lot of people who would say there is no reason to expose that. And James Risen put it in his book. It resulted in the more the 3 or 4 year leak investigation. But that's the kind of thing that happens all the time. I mean, reporters are given classified information by sources, and they make the determination. I don't think that it's fair to say that Snowden shouldn't give a reporter classified information.
But in this case, he said some of the stuff I'm giving you could be really damaging.
Well, so could that nuclear, that covert.
But I mean, even Snowden said, Snowden was implicitly saying, I don't think all of this stuff should be out there. Mm-hmm. In which case, why didn't he just withhold that stuff?
I think that, yes. I mean, I don't know. It could be that he didn't fully understand it, but he thought that to have the full understanding of the program, you needed the other context. Again, a reporter, as you pointed out, doesn't necessarily publish everything you get, but sometimes you need more information to understand the context of what you're reporting and to make that determination of what exactly you should report and what you shouldn't. It's a case-by-case thing, and
mm-hmm.
It really is individual, and you can't have sort of global rules on any of this. It really does come down to what are the specific circumstances.
I don't know if this is unfair or not, but I can't get the image out of my head of giving my 3-year-old son a gallon of ice cream and a spoon and telling him to eat a responsible amount of it.
And yet the majority of the Snowden documents have never been published.
Is that because I know some of the people, intelligence scholars, who got asked, PhD students, fresh out of school, they're some of my best friends, but they wouldn't know how, they don't know how to go through some of this stuff, and so that's one of the hard things, right? You need an expert, but which expert's going to talk to you, and if he or she is going to talk to you, why, right? To get back to that agenda. But let's stay on self-censorship for a minute. Yeah. The British have this sort of voluntary de-notice system, or they had at some point, where you could voluntarily submit something to somebody in Whitehall, and they would tell you yes, no, maybe, or whatever. Are we doing self-censorship right, just kind of leaving it in the wild, in the jungle, or is there a better way to go?
Well, I mean, we do have a First Amendment here, unlike in Britain, really. So that makes things more wide open, for better or for worse, depending on your point of view. I think that there's, we don't have a government-owned press. We don't have an Official Secrets Act. We have some laws that could be interpreted as something that's tantamount to that if somebody decided to push it. But, and so there is, I think, for the better, an unavoidable self-censorship, if I take it as the distinction being from censorship. It's, and you have, I mean, I know, for example, that after the first flub up, that the Washington Post, in all of their subsequent Snowden, I knew Bart Gellman got to know a number of people and really checked out the provenance and accuracy and what's really at risk here and what isn't. And, he made some very careful and discriminate decisions about, okay, I'm going to leave this out, and I'm just going to state a general point here, and I'm not going to talk about this at all. And, the First Amendment does put a lot of power, potentially, into the hands of reporters and editors who, have not been elected to make these kinds of decisions. Now, should everything that is classified remain classified? I mean, somebody I know who worked in the Pentagon, she was reading a paper about the Middle East or something that a colleague had written, and it was stamped top secret. And she goes, why? She went to the guy who wrote it and said, why did you stamp that? Why is it stamped top secret? There's nothing in here. And he said, that's the only way anybody will read it, which is probably true. And so there is a lot of overclassification. Part of it's out of excess caution, but part of it is, I mean, I remember when I got I worked on the Hill a long time ago, and I had a clearance. And the first thing I did, I went to the hearings, and, in the published hearings, it would say deleted for, I want that, I want that. And I thought that's the real deal. It's stuff that's marked classified. It's not true. There's a great line in Ellsberg's memoir, which is actually a very good book called Secrets. And he said that when Henry Kissinger became National Security Advisor, and he'd known Kissinger from Rand and other things, and he said, Henry, here's the thing. you're going to get exposure to more secrets than you possibly knew even existed. You're going to be able to find out everything you ever want to know. But here's what you should know, Henry. Just because something is marked classified, it doesn't mean it's true. And I think that's a good lesson, but everybody wants to overmark to give them some prestige, but also to get it read. So not everything that is classified, like these Hillary emails, I mean, it's just unbelievable. You know, these top secret things. They're mainly discussing drone strikes that happen to be CIA drone strikes, not military drone strikes, and therefore they were top secret, specially compartmented intelligence, even though everybody in the world knew about them, even though NGOs were keeping track of how many people were being killed by them. That was top secret SCI because it's inherently it's a CIA program. That's really about the extent of it. So that's, if things were classified to a reasonable level, there would be much less conversation about this sort of thing. There would be a world where if you saw a top secret document, you would look at it and say, okay, well, yeah, I can see, if you look at the definition of top secret, it's information whose publicity could do grave damage to the security of the United States. If things were marked properly, you would look at this and say, well, Jesus, I see why that's top secret. I better not give that up. But it's not. And that situation, where millions of documents are being classified, creates these ambiguities.
It's true that there's no sanity police when it comes to, you know, why is this classified? Maybe I'll propose that one of these days. I wanted to switch to Kim a little bit with Countdown to Zero Day, and it's kind of two questions rolled into one. The undercurrent is, of course, how long it takes to propose a book, do initial research, you know, have it accepted by an agent or a publisher, come to deadlines, come to reprints, come to proofs, on and on and on. You know, it takes longer, you know, to publish a book than for Congress to do something sometimes. So how do you, you know, how do you struggle with that, or how do you deal with that, or is it a struggle? You know, when especially in PC world or Wired, and then of course, you know, hardbacks when the time is just so much longer. And then also in that, you know, let's talk Countdown to Zero Day in particular. So now it's about 2 years old. You know, is there
Stuxnet is even more, 6 years
right
since its discovery.
So, you know, but you always want to hold off, right? That date of information. I can just put one more thing in here. The publisher won't mind, or, you know. So how do you strike that balance about, you know, look, here I'm cutting it off and I'm going with it. And then, you know, sort of the, you know, a corollary to that, if you were to have, you know, let's say this is, you know, you've sold your 10 millionth copy, and now you're gonna, you know, now you're gonna come back with, you know, the updated version. You know, what does that updated version look like? You know, how do you take what you've done and move ahead for the sequel?
So this was a moving target as I was writing it. Even though the researchers, so Stuxnet was discovered June 2010, it was another year, 2011, the anniversary of the discovery of Stuxnet. I wrote a lengthy article on how the researchers took it apart and figure out what it was doing, and then I got a book contract. And so I didn't really actually start writing the book until sort of spring 2012. You usually get, I mean, I don't know about you, but I mean, I was given a year to work on the book. I was given a deadline of a year by the publisher. They were feeling that any more time than that, and the subject was going to be old and stale and no one would be interested in it. But I missed my deadline. I had a full-time job. I didn't take a leave of absence. Big mistake, rookie's mistake. So I continued to work full-time writing, and then coming home at night and on weekends writing the book. And so that expanded the time, but even though Stuxnet seemed to be a done deal, it was a moving target. I missed my deadline, the end of December 2012, and it turned out to be a good thing that I did, because in January 2013, Symantec, lo and behold, announces that they discovered another version of Stuxnet, turned out to be an early version of Stuxnet, and it changed everything that we knew. Not everything. It changed quite a lot about what we knew about the attack, the way that it unfolded, the actual technical stuff around it, and some of the motives behind it. So in that case, the lengthier time frame that it takes to write a book actually was advantageous in that sense. The issue about like how much you include and how much you don't, well, you'll notice how much thicker mine is than Fred's is, and that was
my shortest.
That was an issue with the publisher. I mean, they did not like that it was so lengthy. But there are footnotes. I don't know if anyone has, noticed. Sometimes on a few pages, not a lot, the footnotes take up almost half the page, more than the actual text.
In that sense, it seems to me like when I read it, it seems very much like a thrilling academic piece of work, because the footnotes are there and they're accessible and they're right there. There's no flipping back and forth. They're right there under the page, and yeah, you can really get into, I was like, what the hell is a .lnk file, and it doesn't take away from the narrative, but if you want
if
to,
it's there,
yeah, you can get after it.
Well, so that was an issue with the publisher. I had a great publisher. He didn't ask me to dumb down the tech. There were times where he said, "You're getting a little too much in the weeds here. Let's dial it back a little." But he gave me the freedom to actually get into the tech. My readers that I had in mind were very specific, was the security community. I wasn't thinking about the broader public. I wasn't thinking about writing something that would appeal to everyone. I was thinking about my Wired readers, and that's who I wanted to focus on. And I wanted to make the security community proud. And that was my goal. And I know that as a reader, when I read a book and I look at a footnote and it only consists of a citation, that really annoys me. I want the footnote to tell me more than the little sentence that introduced the footnote. I want more information. And also, as something that we, is really developed at Wired, is give your readers source material. Nothing more annoying to me than the New York Times or the Washington Post that won't link to an original document so that you can actually see for yourself what it says, or that you can see the gist of the context around it. So that was part of the goal here, is that I know this community, I know my readers, and I know that they want to look up things for themselves. They don't want to just listen to you describe something. So that was the goal there. And I got some initial pushback on the footnotes, and then the editor basically just gave up and said, do it. So
let me start. Go for it.
Oh, well, I was just in my case, it's quite different. This was my 5th book, and my first book, I'd quit a job that I was going to quit anyway to write the book. My other books, I really haven't had a job since. I have a contract deal with Slate. I write, 1.5 columns a week on average. And then, so when I'm doing a book, that's kind of an everyday thing. And I've never spent more than 2 years on a book, in part because, by the end I'm getting kind of bored with this, quite honestly. And I don't know if I could spend, I don't know if I could be Robert Caro, spending 40 years writing about Lyndon Johnson. And I'm glad he did, but I don't think I could. My goal in writing books, this one and there's some other things I've written, my goal is, first, if you don't know much about the topic, you'll come away with it at least thinking that you know quite a bit now. And then if you do know quite a bit about the topic, you won't think that I'm an idiot. That's kind of, I interviewed about more than 100 people for this book, including 6 NSA directors, and went back to them more times than they probably wish they had gotten even engaged with me to make sure I was getting this right. And you said that you were at this meeting, but this other guy who was there says you weren't. Are you sure you're talking about, was this on a Tuesday or a Friday? It's triangulating a lot of things. But I was writing for a general audience, and it could have been a longer book, but I realized that, again, this is a subject that so many people consider forbidding. I wanted to make it look, even in its plain visibility, as an accessible book, something that someone could, Kim is also this way. I'm very much a narrative writer. I embed ideas into the structure of a narrative. so that there's no like, okay, well, let's take a pause and let me explain what computer network, exploitation is. No, it's in the topic of which somebody is coming up with a concept, or it's part of the narrative. So, it's a different style of writing.
As someone who struggles at IKEA to put furniture
well,
together.
Well, that's not meant to be put together. That's the thing.
I can say that they're both extremely accessible, at least for a layperson, and I can see that it would also be extremely valuable to the expert as well. Let me, in my background, I spent some time as an intelligence analyst, and the temptation is always to say, look, I did all this research, so you, Mr. and Mrs. Policymaker, should do this. And of course, you can't do that, right? You've got to keep, you have to keep the analysis true, and even if you might disagree with it, or so there's some implied so what, you're not allowed to take that next step. But for you, right, you both have kind of woven in some of your ideas, so you've got, serious research, with serious interviews and serious footnotes and original documents and the whole thing. But you also, allow yourselves, I think, a little bit more freedom than a pure, analytical or research book. Can you talk about, the process or how you say, look, I've done all this research on Countdown to Zero Day or the history of cyber war, so you guys don't have to. You should just trust me. I did all the math. Here's your answer. Go. Be it on Iran or Stuxnet or whatever. How do you approach that?
Well, I'm also a columnist, and the most boring thing in the world is a columnist who doesn't come to any conclusions. I mean, you're sort of expected. I remember early on when I was very ambivalent about what to do in Afghanistan, and I wrote a column called Confessions of an Ambivalent Columnist, which was, you have to make a point that, okay, I really haven't come up with the answer on this. So yeah, I mean, look, you read my book or Kim's book, you don't have to take that as either one as the final word. Go out and read some other books. But you should come away with it with a word. I mean, you shouldn't read me and have, 6 different conclusions there. You've bought my book, here I am, I'm at the table, here's what I have to say about it, take it or leave it. I used to be a newspaper reporter where, you had limitations on how you can do that. But yeah, I think it's an obligation. If you're writing a biography about somebody, you've got to come down on whether this guy was a hero or a shit. I mean, it's one way. If it can be put down that way, I mean, when you pick up a book, you do so with some trust that, well, this guy's looked at this guy or girl has looked into it. You're implicitly trusting. Well, now, once you're done with it, you can say, well, no, I'm throw it across the room. I don't believe a word of this. But while you're in it, you've got to be, I am the writer writing this book that you are reading, and therefore, go with me, follow me.
Can I sharpen just a little bit for you, Kim? So same question, but layered onto that. Do you, as you're watching the Iran nuclear deal play out and the political jockeying back and forth, did you feel any extra, closeness to Iran policy or Iran nuclear issues, based on all of the things that you had researched and written about?
Well, I mean, you do sort of come down on a side of things. As I was going through, the research about the background on Iran's nuclear program. And I constantly sort of had to pull myself back and say, look at this more objectively, because so much of what we got from the West was that this is definitively a weapons program, no matter what Iran says about it being simply a domestic program. And you sort of have to, if you're writing about it, you have to say, well, what if it is just a domestic program? Let's look at everything that you can see and from a different perspective. So you do that, but you still eventually probably come to some kind of conclusion. And whether or not it was a weapons program, they were really deceptive about the program. Even if it was a domestic program, they were overly deceptive about what they were doing with the domestic program. So obviously it raises a lot of questions, and I think that skepticism is in the book. I didn't pull that back. I didn't accuse Iran of a weapons program, but I did lay it out that it seems pretty strange that these are all of the things that they were hiding. At the end of the book, so I had 2 criticisms. The book, I mean, for the most part, if you look at the reviews on Amazon, they're quite positive, but two of the criticisms were the length and that people didn't like my opinion in the book. The last chapter where I talk about sort of what does all of this mean, and in particular, what does this mean going forward, and what does it mean that the U.S. Loses the moral high ground in being the first to unleash a digital weapon, or let's say the first digital weapon that got caught. And I go over that. I didn't think that I was leaning too heavily in one direction. I was just pointing out the risks and the negative consequences of this, and without having a public debate about the use of digital weapons. I thought I was simply just laying all of that out. And there were readers who took issue with that and said, I wish you would just shut up, just tell me the facts and get out of the book. And I didn't think I included that much of that in there, but there were some people who did.
Can I just qualify on one thing, because I don't want to give the wrong impression. One thing that I've done in all of my books is that I'll be writing about somebody and his views, and I might ultimately, you'll see, disagree with them. But one thing that I think I have an obligation to do is to lay it out from that person's point of view. In other words, this may seem on the surface a crazy point of view, but actually no. Let's take a look at it from why he's going in this direction. There is a logic to it. Very few people are just kind of, who are risen high in the field, are just plain stupid or evil. There is a logic there. There is a reason. And one thing that I'm doing in this book and other books is to explain how they came to this position.
Even if you don't agree with it.
Even if I don't agree, but I mean, some of my books, people, at least in the beginning part, go, well, I don't know where you're coming down on this. It sounds like you're agreeing with this guy and you're agreeing with that. I said, no, I'm just laying out to you what their mental processes are. You just go with it, see where it winds up. So I think books that there are books about this and other things that just kind of, throw eggs at it from the very beginning. And I think, that's not terribly useful. That's for rousing the choir, but not for deepening understanding.
You talked. One of your first questions was, like, what is the role of the press? And I don't know if you've come across this, but one of the things that it's been so funny. Post-publication of the book is the number of people in government who come up to you and thank you for writing the book because it's something that they can't talk about publicly, right? Any kind of classified program, they can't actually speak about it, but they love being able to point to it and say, just read this, or putting it in presentations or in classrooms, people in government, in military schools and things like that. They love that something like this is available that they wouldn't be able to talk about openly, but now they can actually teach it because it's a book.
I've heard that too.
So that's, sort of a role that you play in putting out information that they don't necessarily want out there, but they love it when it is out there.
Yeah, it's a great shortcut for those of us who will always have a pre-publication review agreement, till the end of time, being able to say, according to Kim Zetter, the following, right? And that gets you out of it. I didn't say it. Kim said it.
Right.
I'm just, look, check the footnote.
Right. There's abuse for that, though, because you see a lot of times what happens is that you'll get an anonymous government leaker to... This used to happen all the time with Siobhan Gorman. When she was at the Baltimore Sun. An anonymous official would leak to her, and so then once the information is in the newspaper, then you have the official who actually leaked to her anonymously pointing out it publicly and saying, well, we know about it because look at there, it's reported in the Baltimore Sun, and yet they were the ones that leaked it. So it becomes very useful.
I will make a confession.
Out there.
When I was a congressional aide in the late 70s, working for Les Aspin on the House of Representatives, I would sometimes write a paper and it would talk about something, and I knew what the classified fact was. There were 3 sources out there, articles, that had slightly different facts, and I knew which one had the right one. So I picked that one and footnoted that. I think people do that now and then as well.
I put according to outstanding scholars, but then I always endnote myself.
Well, you can do that too, yeah.
You should try it. It's a neat trick. I want to make sure that we have enough time to get to audience questions and sort of robust participation. as I understand it, the candidates have agreed to make no closing statements to preserve, the time for the American people.
Such a nasty woman.
I love Kim. Okay, so without further ado,
Have you got your nasty woman T-shirt?
let's get to the questions. But
it.
if you could just hold on for a second while the microphones get where they're going. I think Corvin's got the first one.
It's good afternoon. I'm Sergeant David Beckstrom with Military Public Affairs. As a reporter, how do we deal with other reporters that either disregard or try to discredit due to bias or non-caring, yet real sources, not necessarily like WikiLeaks, how CNN bashed WikiLeaks. How do we deal with that to be able to continue to use different outlets like these?
So wait, your question is your question, what do we think of WikiLeaks? Or I'm not quite sure what the...
No, the question is, how do we deal with other reporters discrediting true sources, not necessarily just WikiLeaks? That was just one that popped in my head when I...
Wait, who's the we in this question? I'm not quite sure.
Reporters.
Oh.
Because that's what I do for the military. I'm a military reporter.
I don't know. I'm not quite sure about reporters discrediting other reporters. I don't know what you mean.
Discrediting the sources that other reporters are using.
Like, give me an example. I'm not quite
sure. Where Chris Cuomo from CNN discredited, saying WikiLeaks is only for...
I see.
That
so
type of stuff.
Just a blanket thing on the whole... Well, WikiLeaks is kind of an interesting case because I think that they have evolved into something other than what they started out being. I mean, they started out to be a clearinghouse for leakers everywhere. And I think there was a time when they were about to leak some stuff about Russia, and a visit was paid, and that was the end of that. And, I think it's fair to say that at this point they're just kind of a Kremlin outpost, quite honestly. Now, this raises a question, though. With a few exceptions where it seems that some of these emails from the Podesta files seem to have been tampered with a bit, still, this is stuff that's real. It's real stuff. So what do you do about that?
What do you do about yellow cake?
Yeah.
I mean, any of your sources can give you falsified or...
Right. But let's say the information is true, or at least nobody's denied it. And yet it comes from, I just wrote a column about this. It comes from an outfit like WikiLeaks, and not only an outfit like WikiLeaks, but an outfit that has been leaking information that was hacked, according to the U.S. Intelligence Committee, by Russia's senior-most officials with the intent of influencing the U.S. election process. Now, some have said, and Glenn Greenwald in his defense said, motive should not be taken into account in terms of whether you should publish something. And his point, and it's true, is as we said earlier, a lot of whistleblowers they have motives. We now know that Deep Throat in Watergate was involved in a power struggle within the FBI. That's what a lot of it was about. Does that make the publication of those stories invalid or corrupt, or does that mean that Woodward should have thrown it in the wastebasket? No. But what about if it's coming directly or indirectly from a foreign intelligence, from a foreign power, and a somewhat adversarial foreign power as that? Should that influence an editor's or writer's decision to go ahead and publish it? At what point does newsworthiness and the public right to... This is all assuming that there's nothing in this which endangers national security or anything like that. But at what point does interesting and newsworthy and in the public interest collide with the fact that your awareness that you are serving the interests of a foreign power in doing this? I raise this as a question.
Right. So I think that there are sort of two parts of that, and one is you assess the motive. It doesn't necessarily mean that it colors your decision. You can still come to the conclusion that you're going to publish anyway. The difference here with WikiLeaks is if you get a cache of emails like that, some of those are going to be personal emails that have nothing to do with, that have no news value and all of that. And so any other news outlet that would get a cache of emails like that would actually sift through them and find the ones that have news value and publish those, and then would not report on the personal ones. So that's the only difference here, is that WikiLeaks is not making that distinction. Any other newspaper would publish hacked emails. If they could verify that these were legitimate emails, it wouldn't matter where they came from. If they got emails in that way, and they pointed to something that was newsworthy, they would publish it. So the fact that they're hacked emails doesn't really matter. Now, I understand your point about, well, if the hacker is, and I really don't think that Russian officials were hacking into the DNC. At the most, we may be talking about here criminal hackers in Russia who got access to something and were surprised that they got access to what they got access to. And they might have some links to the government, but I really don't know that, and suspect that this was actually directed by.
Well, the Director of National Intelligence said this was directed and authorized by Russia's senior-most officials. It was quite specific.
If you have signals intelligence making those directions, then you can say that. Yeah. But I just wonder, like, what is the evidence for that? And also, the problem with Russia is that we have hybrid hackers there. So you have, it's not a clear distinction between hackers who are criminal hackers and nation-state hackers. You have hackers who are criminal hackers who will get into systems. And then if they find something interesting, then they'll pass it off to the government. So they might have sort of a long-standing arrangement and agreement like that, but ultimately they are criminal hackers. I'll take just to get off topic briefly, the hack of Ukraine power grid in December. That looks like sort of a two-stage, two-party hack. The initial hack started with coming in with a phishing attack 6 months before the actual outage occurred. That was likely a criminal group, very low level, unsophisticated, but the actual hack that brought down the grid was much more sophisticated by parties that actually had to know how those industrial control systems work. They overwrote the firmware on the remote terminal units. That takes skill. And so there's sort of evidence there of maybe what happened was the criminal hackers got in, they thought, wow, this is a valuable system, and then they hand it off to maybe a nation-state hacker. So it's hard to know. All of this gets very muddy, and so when you say state-directed, that can be a little deceiving. It's hard to know what that is. But anyways, in terms of these kinds of leaks, again, the actual hacking part isn't necessarily the problem. It is the whole of what you publish from those and the determinations you make. I don't think we ever actually answered your question, though. I'm sorry. And we have a lot of other questions, so sorry if the answer was too long.
Let me just abuse the chair to kind of sharpen that, though, because every time Russia's getting its way in the world, I think of Lenin calling people useful idiots, and then I try to go around and figure out
selling the rope that's used to hang them next.
Who's the useful idiot here? And I wondered. I mean, is that WikiLeaks? Is that Julian Assange? Or is that the people who use that as source material and then do what we're accusing them of doing, that is to say hijacking or trying to interfere with...
I think in this case WikiLeaks is doing what it wants to be doing. I think that didn't used to be the case.
So if they hadn't gone to WikiLeaks, if whoever obtained those went to the New York Times with them, and the New York Times sort of sifted through them and published, would you be saying that the New York Times is serving the purposes of the Russian government?
Would they have known that it was the Russian, like the Russian ambassador comes up to them and says, here is some material that we
It's probably not going to be that direct.
Well, no, but look, I think the one point you raised, which is the pertinent one, you said, look, some newspaper is going to be publishing this. And, we have a system where I cannot imagine the editor of the New York Times getting on the phone, calling the editor of the Washington Post and saying, what are you going to do with this?
Right.
Should we be doing that? That's not how it works. And so there is going to be an impulse. We better publish this because the other guy's going to publish it. But I suspect, and I haven't talked with Marty Barron or anybody else about this, but I suspect that editors are getting it's a little bit disturbing. Like, well, how far are we going to go with this? We have stuff coming over the transom. It hasn't been gotten by our people, or even people that our people are talking to. It's just coming from mysterious people, and they're just hacking Hillary Clinton's campaign. Donald Trump's computers are, 12 years old. Nothing is coming out of there.
Let me propose this, though.
He has the best computers.
What
and the
if-
best
we have the
people
best
on those
computers.
His son, yes.
The best
Let
Windows.
me propose this. Let me propose this. And this is, you can do accuse me of conspiracy, but I'm just going to be the devil's advocate on this.
Okay.
What if the government is claiming that this is a Russian nation-state directed hack in order to make those news editors nervous about publishing information that they might have in their hands?
So you're saying that James Clapper is
I'm saying what
so
if.
enmeshed with the Hillary Clinton campaign.
I'm saying what
He's
if.
doing her bidding. Or he called up, Jake Sullivan the day before. We're going to do you guys a favor. Well, I don't think that's the way it works,
Right.
but it's conceivable that it could be the way it works.
I mean, they do try to convince when you go to the government
Yeah.
and you have classified information
Yeah.
and you say, I'm thinking of publishing this, and they make a case against it,
Yeah.
sometimes they're just making up their case.
Sometimes they are, and sometimes you can kind of tell.
Sometimes, yeah. They can be transparent. And sometimes they're kind of laughing when
Well,
they're telling you
sometimes
because they know it's not going to work.
Well, there was one New York Times story, and I forget which one it was.
The warrantless wiretapping? Where they
where
held it for a year.
Bush called Bill Keller, the editor, into President Bush himself.
It's intimidating.
Made the
yeah.
case. Yeah, but that doesn't happen very often. And Keller did take it very seriously and waited
held
a
it
while,
for a
as you
year.
say, and then published it.
Yeah.
So, is there some 23-year-old intern who's giving you the briefing, or is it the chief
Right.
of staff to, but yeah, no, but this is how
tough
everything else
questions.
is changing
They're
in the
tough
world.
questions, yeah.
It's changing in the news profession too. You get,
No one wants to make a
you
mistake.
get Donald Trump's emails. It's in your inbox from an envelope that has Trump Towers in the return address. You open it up. There's his tax returns. You check it out with his accountant. Yep, that's the tax return.
And it may have been a stolen tax return.
It may have been. The suspicion is that it was Marla, because her signature was on it, in which case it wasn't even stolen. It was hers as well. But in any event, reporters and editors have always had to deal with what do you do when you get secrets? How do you treat these? And we've discussed this. In every case, you go check it out. A, is it true? B, is it really, really damaging? But what do you do when you get it from somebody who's, and everybody, from an anonymous source, or just email intercept, private email? I mean, this is a whole new universe. It's the kind of, it's something that you haven't had to deal with before. It goes beyond, you realize whistleblower's motives. He just might be pissed at somebody. And okay, take that into account, but only whether that colors the degree to which this is true, or there might be some countervailing evidence that disproves what he's doing. But this is a little bit different when you get into international influences as well. I don't know. And then, because it is a competitive business, I mean the news business, if it's out there and a lot of people have it, it's, again, that there's no consortium where,
And if you do say no, it's just going to be taken to another reporter. I mean, the whole warrantless wiretapping.
Well, if you're the editor,
outside of the Bush thing, if you recall, the story that eventually got published about AT&T's secret room was rejected by 6 different papers. The Mark Klein, who was an AT&T employer, who was the whistleblower on that, tried to take it to, I think it was the Associated Press. He took it to the Los Angeles Times. In total, six media outlets declined to publish that. And it was only after he brought it to the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and they were going to file a lawsuit, and then he brought the documents actually to Wired, and we published them. But 6 mainstream media outlets just declined to publish that. I don't ultimately know why the editors, I forget why the Los Angeles Times, the reporter who received that information was quite angry with his editors when they declined to publish it. Turned out to be completely true. And I don't know if it was, I don't know. I really don't know why in that case. I mean, it wasn't a case like the New York Times where they held on to it for a year. 6 media outlets decided not to publish that.
So. We've got a lot of hands.
Yeah,
so
sorry.
We move ahead.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for having this conversation. I'd like to get back to the issue of classification and getting. Fred, you wrote about this in your book. Seems to be a distinction between the way in which the Obama administration thinks and talks about cyber defense versus cyber offense. When it comes to cyber defense, they're far more willing to have in Sven's words, a normal adult conversation about these things. But when it comes to cyber offense or cyber attack, it's almost as if the concept doesn't exist. And the question that I have is, do you think that the administration is acting in a responsible way in with respect to these matters?
I would say, actually, to the contrary, that the Obama administration is the first one that's acknowledged that there's such a thing as cyber offensive operations. Up until and that's only quite recently. I mean, this year.
They were kind of forced into it.
Yeah, they were. But it's interesting that back in the, I forget when this is, Mike Warner might be able to help me out on this. There was about to be, I guess it was around 08, 07, there was about to be some openness. There were a lot of people in the intelligence community who were saying, it's time that we acknowledge that this exists. If we want it to be as a deterrent, people ought to know about it, right? And the NSA started putting out some historical material, declassifying things, which talked about CNA authorities and that sort of thing. The Air Force was about to come out with a policy statement, which talked about cyber offensive operations. And then President Obama started criticizing China for cyber operations against us, and Leon Panetta, who was Secretary of Defense at the time, put the kibosh on the Air Force release because he didn't want Obama to look hypocritical. But I think this is one problem that everybody in this room, including us, has, that this has been, as I said earlier, so enmeshed in secrecy, it's very hard to write about or talk about any of it. I think I see no reason why. I mean, operational details and so forth, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, let's keep that secret. But the fact of these programs, it's kind of crazy that these were some of the fact that there was something called computer network attack as a developed option. The fact that that was one of the most classified things that there was in the entire U.S. government is kind of nuts. As somebody said in another panel, it's not, when you bomb a target, there's nothing, you might have even killed people. There's nothing classified about that, maybe because you can't disguise it. But if you hacked into something that shuts it down for a month without killing anybody, and that's an enormous secret, even though as soon as it happens, the other side knows about it as well. And then now there are 20 countries in the world whose militaries have cyber units of some sort, which have offensive and defensive characteristics. I mean, I hope that a lot more becomes open about this subject. I think the panel that was up here before us, talking about at what a primitive state just basic precautions are about the electrical grid. Part of this is because the whole topic has been enmeshed in above top secret level. And I think I would welcome an opening of this conversation to open it up quite a bit. It's also one reason why nobody knows what cyber deterrence means right now. Nobody knows what anything means because nobody has been in a position, people of a strategic bent, they haven't had access to enough information even to do the kind of analysis that's needed to come up with sensible strategies that someone on the outside might be in a better position than someone on the inside to formulate.
Let's keep it. Corv, are we?
Hello, I'm a fellow journalist. I've got another question about Snowden, if you don't mind. It struck me over the last 3 years in the interviews that he's given, there's been only one interviewer that actually asked him any questions that could be considered hard questions.
John Oliver.
As opposed to softball, which is John Oliver, exactly. John Oliver asked him, have you read these documents? And of course he hadn't read them all. There's, a million of them or so. And the question actually caught Snowden, off guard, and he didn't quite know how to answer it. But every other interview has been complete softballs. I mean, unbelievable. And why do you think there's been so little scrutiny of him as a source?
Well,
That's question one, but I want to ask another question, which is, all his documents are now controlled by a billionaire, Pierre Omidyar, who owns The Intercept. I know there's some at the Post. Are you troubled at all by the fact that all these documents are held by a private company?
I would say this. I mean, and I don't know anybody who disagrees with me on this point. If you do, we'll see. At this point, the Russians have these documents. The Chinese. I don't think.
I disagree.
Well, I don't think that that Snowden was a Russian spy. I think he might have been used by some people. But look, I was once. I was talking with one of the reporters about this, and I said, look, even if Snowden didn't give this stuff up to the Russians, they've got it from your computer. They've got it from so-and-so's computer. And he said, well, no, actually I have to tell you that I've encrypted all of my files. And I told that story to the guy who created the NSA's Computer Security Center. And he just laughed. He laughed heartily. Once these things leave the building, once somebody who does not have a SCIF in his house.
Apparently, they don't actually have to be in a SCIF to be.
I'm just saying these documents are worth a lot of money and effort for somebody to get their hands on. And it is assumed that whatever Bart Gellman and Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras had is now in various corners of the world.
Okay, so that's different than what I thought you were saying. I thought you were making the argument that a lot of government people made afterwards that Snowden basically just took them to Russia with him. And I don't think that's the case. But I agree.
No, I don't think so.
I agree that
anybody he gave them, whatever he gave to people, a lot of people now.
Well, I mean, I don't know if you guys have read Glenn Greenwald's book. This was really remarkable to me. They talk about in there when he and Laura were going to meet with Snowden for the first time. Laura had already received the documents, and she had them on a USB stick. And there's a scene that he's describing where they're in the back of a cab in New York on their way to the airport, and she pulls that USB stick out of her backpack and shows it to him and says, the documents are here. I was stunned by that. So I was stunned by that, and then I'm also stunned by the scene when they're actually on the plane flying to meet him in China, and they're sitting there looking at them on Glenn's computer. And he makes this remark about all the people who are walking up and down the aisle, who are walking, on the plane.
Oh, on the plane.
On the plane to China, before they ever get to Snowden. Laura already has the documents. And he describes a scene of people walking up and down the aisle, and he says, if only they knew what he was looking at. I mean, so you're right. That once those documents are handed off to someone who doesn't understand security or even tries security, but you are a target. So yes, it does make the documents less secure. However, I just want to point out that a 20-year veteran of the NSA was taking documents home on a daily basis.
Yeah, just stunning.
And so we don't know that. I guess the point that I'm making is that pointing out Snowden as the security risk here is probably missing a lot of other NSA employees who have a boarded load at their house.
But on the softball questions, it kind of stuns me too. I mean, I'm kind of known as one of the liberal Snowden critics. And it's, when, who was it? Was it Brian Williams who went to Moscow and did an interview? And it was all...
I wonder how much of that is journalists being sensitive about sources in general. So there quite oftentimes, we'll read a story and it'll be an anonymous source, and we know who the anonymous source is.
But this is a guy who came out.
It's clear to us,
and
right?
He's also, he's.
I know that, but I'm saying that oftentimes we don't. First of all, we don't want to expose another reporter's source if it's an anonymous source and we know who it is. We also don't want to necessarily criticize sources of other journalists because we're all in the business of sources. And I'm wondering if maybe that part of it, I don't know.
I mean, I think.
But you're right. There should be definitely more scrutiny.
But can I just complain for a second? I mean, my wife's not here. I can complain as much as I want. So, I wonder if the Snowden noise or the Manning noise or the new guy and the noise about that has, in the United States, we have, for researchers, both academic and, professional authors, we have an enormous richness of declassified files, properly declassified files from CIA, from FBI, from NSA. Even the Brits, who we never thought were going to get in the game of declassification, have just sent, a bunch of security service files down to Q, and there's all of this richness. And I wonder, are we missing the fact that these governments are being so much more transparent, sending more files now in the KV series to Q than I could ever go through, I feel like in a lifetime, so much material there, and yet we're not talking about that, so we kind of give the sop to Snowden supporters. Well, he did help the transparency process along. And yet there's all of this information funneling into publicly available archives that we're not talking about.
But not about domestic surveillance. I mean,
it's not sexy enough? Or?
No, not about domestic surveillance. Not about. And I think I'm one journalist, and possibly because I'm not just a journalist who is fascinated by this release of declassified files. I don't think that many journalists are, and I don't think there's. I think these agencies that release all this stuff, except for the National Security Archive at GW, which does a very good job of serving as kind of a clearinghouse for a lot of this stuff and putting out reports that summarize them. I think the government could do a better job of publicizing. Like, okay, we're putting out some stuff on the 1953 Iran coup. Finally,
I think that part of the view, though, is if the government is releasing it, it's not going to be interesting. It's only the stuff that they're withholding from us.
But
so people overlook.
Right. So people in the ivory tower, we order up batches of documents, hoping to find these neat things. And people who are more on the journalism side,
But it's not true. I mean, we're now getting to the point where things are being declassified about things that I reported on at the time as a reporter, and I'm finding this just fascinating. What?
Did you get it right?
Well, to the extent that anybody. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on in the background that nobody ever knew. Stuff about what happened at Reykjavik. It's fascinating to read this stuff now.
Let me. Sir.
Sorry.
There's
one back there also.
Did I mess it up? Sorry,
right.
Carl.
So I wanted to ask a non-Snowden question, but go back to this gatekeepers idea, especially with journalists.
Back to the what idea?
The gatekeepers idea.
Gatekeepers.
How do you balance explaining the background? There's so much detail and definition and sort of basic conceptual frameworks that you have to get across to people when you're trying to communicate some of these more abstract ideas. So two questions. First, how do you balance that? This is what a vulnerability is. This is what a 0-day is. This is what the internet is, sort of process definition and explanation, with trying to create a narrative and actually impart some more substantive points. And second, how have you felt that balance shifting with your editors and with your audience? Is it getting easier to explain that? Is it getting less necessary to explain these sorts of background
that's
details?
Interesting.
So I do a lot of explanation in the book, and there's a lot of detail in there. Because I had to take into consideration that a lot of my readers were technical and already understood it, but there were all going to be people who didn't. I did explain a lot. In terms of with my editors, I found, so when I used to have an editor who was very technical and very security, and I didn't have to do a lot of explanation in the stories because he understood and I guess he was expecting readers. I then got an editor who didn't know anything about security at all. And I found that I was having to define encryption. I was having to define a hash. Things that for a decade I'd been just reporting in stories. I think that it's changed because our readers have changed, because now security is of interest to everyone and is of interest to the mainstream media. You have to be more inclusive, and you do have to do a lot more explaining of what you considered basic terms before.
Sometimes it's good to get an editor like that.
Sometimes it is good. You have to be reminded that not everyone is up to speed.
Yeah. But I think the more that you can embed this within the narrative, and then becomes both more interesting and more comprehensible. If you have like a chapter on explaining all this stuff, it's like the whaling boat chapter in Moby Dick. There's a tendency just to skip over that part, right? So the more you can
but
put
fascinating
it in,
if you spend the time.
yes,
Yeah.
if you're interested in that sort of thing, yeah. Yes. Okay.
That's why you put in a footnote, so that those
Yeah,
are
right.
there.
Yeah, that's it. Here it is if you need it, but yeah, that's a good way too.
Sure. Well, thank you for the insight on the Fourth Estate and the orthogonal nature of your contribution to national defense, and I mean that sincerely. But given what you've been reporting on, have you felt the reticle of cyber intrusion in your own lives? I would imagine you start rising up and being attacked yourselves.
You mean somebody hacking us, or
starting to surveil you?
Well, if they are, I don't know about it.
So is it the U.S. government or?
No.
Yeah.
Well, somebody once asked me, well, you're doing this book. What are you doing, to protect yourself? And, I said, well, look, if what you're trying to do is to keep someone from hacking into your checking account or to get your Netflix password or something, there are things you can do, and you all know what they are. And, it's like, I remember during the Cold War, Scoop Jackson said that the Russians are like a hotel thief. They try out one, they go to the next door, and if it's locked, they keep going, but if it's not, then they'll, and that's what most hackers are. That they're looking for easy entrees. And if you know better than to click on to a fishing expedition or whatever, there are certain fundamental hygiene things, and sometimes you fuck up and they get through anyway. But I go on, if somebody really wants something that you have, and especially if they have the wherewithal and resources of a nation state, there's not much you can do about it. I mean, people, protect your sources, keep your notes somewhere else, don't have that on a laptop that you carry around with you everywhere and it's online all the time. If the NSA, I don't think they would, but if they or if some foreign, if they want to get into my laptop, there's really, the answer, of course, is not to put very much stuff on your laptop. I mean, there's almost nothing on my phone. There's almost nothing on my phone. But, because, if somebody wants to get in and they know how, and it's really important to them, they're going to get in. I mean, that's one lesson of, but if I've been hacked, I don't know about it.
So I would say that my adversary has changed since I started journalism. When I was starting in 1999, and pretty much I would say until around, let's say 2008, 2009, my adversaries were hackers out for the lulz, right? Mm-hmm. I cover hackers, I interview hackers. Nothing more fun, right, than popping a reporter.
Yeah, let's get into Kim Zetter's files today. Yeah.
But they never, if they did, they didn't expose anything. My adversary has changed now. I started writing about a lot of nation-state attacks, exposing nation-state attacks, exposing Chinese nation-state hacks, Russian nation-state hacks, Israeli nation-state hacks, U.S. nation-state hacks. And so your adversary becomes much different in that regard. But you have two adversaries as a journalist covering this area, and one is the adversary who wants to get the information that you're getting ready to publish, and the adversary who wants to know the identity of your source. And that's changed for journalists. We now have the U.S. government as an adversary. You've always sort of had that to a certain degree when you deal with anonymous sources, but the landscape for that has changed now. So previously, Woodward and Bernstein, where did they meet their source? In an underground garage. These days, the surveillance cameras in that underground garage are going to get you. Or the mobile phone that you and your source carry in your hand to that meeting, that face meeting, is going to get you. So there are a lot of other things that you have to do in a different adversarial sense as a journalist dealing with this kind of stuff. You don't take electronics with you. If you meet a source in person and you take a cab, you don't pay with a credit card. So different, I guess, what we call threat models. With regard to the nation state, that's a difficult threat model to protect yourself against. And I will tell you that most newspapers, I think this is only recently after the New York Times got hacked, BuzzFeed has been hacked, media historically don't take security seriously. They are, and it's a problem. And I think they're only now coming to the realization that they do have valuable information that they need to protect.
So there's a vast market for cyber-human tradecraft that if I ever get fired from West Point, I can look into. Well, unfortunately, we're basically out of time here. So I want to thank you both very much for a very interesting panel. And